Let's talk about what I believe is happening outside of today's Republican Party. So, most of the headlines that I consume every day, they focus on conflict. Who's fighting with who said what, who's leading in the polls, who's under investigation. But I want to argue that if we only focus on those daily stories, I think we're missing a much larger political sort of transformation that's taking place. And I went into this a bit in my last chat, and I believe we are watching a brand new coalition begin to form, not just Democrats, not just independents, not even just former Republicans, but a coalition of people who may disagree on dozens of issues while agreeing on one central idea that American democracy and government need to move in a different direction. Now, if you're looking for one leader or one movement that represents all of those people, I don't think we'll find that one. History also doesn't work that way. When we look back at Abraham Lincoln, we imagine everyone knew he would become one of America's most important presidents, but they didn't. At the time, there were dozens of competing ideas, different political movements, different leaders, different versions for the country's future. The same thing happened during the progressive era. Looking back, we remember the leaders who emerged, but we forget about all of the people, all of the ideas, all of the movements that didn't. And that's why these moments always feel confusing when we're living through them. No one knows which voices will come through, which voices will ultimately define the future. And honestly, I think that's an important reminder because today it can feel like politics are more divided than ever. And another way of looking at this is that people are actively debating what the next chapter of America should look like. You're hearing more conversations about affordability than I think we've heard in decades. We've heard more about housing and healthcare and childcare, AI, education, immigration, these conversations that don't all fit neatly inside the traditional Democratic or even Republican label anymore. And these are conversations about what kind of country Americans want to build over the next 20 or over the next 30 years. And many of these issues don't divide people the same way older political issues did. Let's take AI. There are Democrats that are worried about it. There are Republicans worried about it. There are independents. And the same is true with data centers, with the future of work, with housing and healthcare. And, that's another sign that our political coalitions are changing. Another observation that I think is worth thinking about is that many people assume that disagreements inside the Democratic coalition is a sign of weakness. And I see it differently. Disagreement is exactly what we want when a coalition is growing. Think about it. If more people are joining the conversation, they're going to bring different priorities, different experiences, or solutions. And I think that is what we need. We need to be talking about what should be prioritized, what we should focus on. And then we test those ideas. We see which gain support, which fade away. And then eventually something begins to take shape. And throughout American history, there's always been political movements trying to define themselves. And we don't know which politicians will emerge or which ideas will survive, but that's always been that's how we determine which systems aren't working. And I think that's where we are today in this moment. Whether you agree with this or not, it's the questions I think we should be asking. And we should continue defining what our political system needs to look like. And let's begin replacing what's been in place and what hasn't been working. And if we stop looking at politics sort of one day at a time, we can really start noticing the trends that might not be obvious in the moment. Parties are changing. Younger leaders are stepping forward. Entirely new policy debates are beginning to dominate the public conversation, and that's fantastic. Issues that barely existed a decade ago are really becoming central to American politics. And that is exactly what we need. These aren't temporary news stories, these aren't questions that will shape politics for years to come. This is a whole new political era. I think, periods like this have always felt uncertain. We rarely understand how significant these sort of times in space are until years later, and I can feel this one. And maybe that's the biggest lesson from this entire conversation is we're all trying to predict where America is headed. What we do know is that there are moments of transformation that have happened before, and they've been uncomfortable, they've been diverse, they've been filled with uncertainty, but they've also been the moments that ultimately reshaped this country. So instead of letting every single headline pile up and sort of pull you in a different direction, let's take a step back every once in a while. Let's notice the patterns we're seeing, and let's sort of hold on to what is being created, because that's where I think most of the most important conversations are happening. And again, continue to follow, continue to like. I will break down these stories happening in America today, and I will see you next time.